Greetings, dear friends, fellow programmers, and those aspiring to be. I have a very interesting question for you. Have you ever wondered how JavaScript can seemingly predict the future? Today, we are diving into fascinating and sometimes confusing topic about JavaScript. I'm talking about variable hoisting. Before we begin, I would like to promise you that I will do my best to explain this concept in a fun and easy to understand fashion. Because if I did not do it, probably some of you will get a desire to kill themselves because the concept itself is sometimes difficult to understand and makes people want to pull their hair out because of it. And one more note before we begin. Hoisting is another concept that frequently gets discussed on job interviews. So if you would like to improve your success rate, I highly recommend you to stick around and enjoy this video. What exactly is hoisting? Well, it's one of the core mechanisms of JavaScript that pushes the definition of variables and functions to the top of the scope. Okay, I know this can sound a bit abstract, but let me use an example to try to paint the picture you would understand easier. I want you to imagine the following scenario. You are replacing your code with a stage play, and before the play begins, all the actors come to the stage. And when I say actors, I actually mean variables and functions. And when I say they come to the stage, it means basically they are brought up to the beginning of their current scope in JavaScript. And when I say scenes of the play being performed, I'm talking about the code execution in reality in JavaScript. Actors are functions and variables, and they're being hoisted to the top of their current scope, which is actors coming out to introduce themselves, and also all of that is happening before any actual play starts being performed in reality. And that translates to code being executed. But a very important thing to note is that only variable and function declarations are being hoisted to the top of the scope. When it comes to value initialization, it is not moved at all. It stays at the same exact location where you have put it as a developer. And to prove this, let me run the IDE. And here we are. We have an extremely simple piece of code. We have a console log that is logging a value of our myVar variable before we have actually populated it with a value. And then we are logging it again after we have populated it with value. And what will happen when I run this code? I want you to think about 3, 2, 1 right now. And now that you are done thinking about the results, let us compare it with what we actually get. When I run this, we get undefined right here, which is the result of the fact that our variable does exist. Take a note here, we did not get an error stating that this variable is a invalid reference. We're not getting that. We're just getting that its value is undefined, which is completely true because its value is defined right here and we are printing it right here. But what happened is exactly the following scenario. Let me show you this piece of code right here. So this is how the compiler of JavaScript is going to observe this piece of code. It will first hoist myVar variable to the top of the current scope, which is in this case global scope. It is hoisted to the top. Then we are printing the value of this variable, which is not defined at this point because the compiler has not moved the value assignment as well. It just moved the definition. And when we print the value, we get undefined. But after we have imprinted the value into the variable, we can just print what is stored inside of it right here. So I hope things are a bit clearer right now. Awesome job! Now that we are done with hoisting of variables, let us discuss hoisting of functions, because it's also an essential aspect of JavaScript. So when it comes to functions, hoisting implies that not only the definition of a function is moved to the top of the scope, but also its implementation. So when we jump right back to our IDE and take a look at our example right here, we'll see that our function invocation is taking place before we have actually defined the function, but when I run the code, everything should be working perfectly fine, which is the case. We get hello. So we did not hoist only the definition of our function so that compiler knows that read function exists, but also its implementation has been moved as well. And when we run it, even though it's before it was defined in our code, we will get a completely fully functional function. Whoa, that was a mouthful. So basically, what we are getting is something like this. Our function gets hoisted to the top of the current scope, which is in this case global scope. And when we run it, everything seems to be working perfectly fine. But I want you to note here the fact that JavaScript is going to hoist your functions to the top of the scope does not mean that you should put your function definition anywhere you want in code. It should be defined and placed carefully within your code so it's in a meaningful location. That way you would have easier time to navigate the code and find the implementation for your functions in a place that makes sense. If you just randomly place pieces of code, it will be a hell on earth to navigate it. But it doesn't change the fact that your code will be working even when you invoke functions before they're defined. And the third and final part that I want to cover when it comes to hoisting is dedicated to block scope variable types. I'm talking about let and const keywords. So whenever you use let or const keywords to create a variable, it means that they will be hoisted, their definition will be moved to the top of the scope, as well as it would be the case for var type of variables. But in this case, if you use and if you try to invoke value of any of these variables before their value is initialized, you will get an error which is going to break the code. So you will get a reference error. Let me show you what I mean. And here we are. You cannot access myLet before initialization. So myLet is right here and we are trying to invoke it right here. So before you initialize it, you cannot invoke it, which means that theoretically you can define the variable and not use it until the point in code where you have initialized it, and your code will work perfectly fine. But as soon as you try to use this variable value before it was initialized, you will get a reference error. So that is a huge difference when compared to var and let, because var is just going to give you undefined as a value that is stored inside of a variable, while on the other hand, let is going to explode your code and give you a reference error. And this also applies to const keyword. And finally, one last topic I would like to cover about hoisting is hoisting within function and block scopes. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, I was trying to be explicit about it. So when you're hoisting variables and functions, they are not being hoisted to the top of the global scope, they're being hoisted to the top of their current scope. So if you are instantiating a variable that is inside of a function scope, like right here in this example, it will not be hoisted to the top of the global scope, it will be hoisted to the top of this function scope right here. So it will be hoisted to the top of the test hoisting function scope. And that also applies to the block scope as well. So basically everything is exactly the same, but you have to be very careful that we are talking about moving variable definition and function definition and implementation to the top of its current scope. So have that in mind, it's very important to note that. And when I run this piece of code, we are going to get exactly the same result as we did in global scope that we had here in the beginning. We are going to get undefined here because inside function variable was just hoisted for its definition and not its assignment of value. So value assignment is still here, and right here when we are trying to invoke it, we get the undefined value which was assigned when it was hoisted to the top while just defined. So everything works exactly the same as it did with the global scope in the beginning. Now that you understand this concept, I'm sure you will have much easier and more enjoyable time working with JavaScript, because this concept tends to trip a lot of people off, because it's not as easy and intuitive as one might think. That is why, in this video, I wanted to spend time explaining exactly how it works and why you should be extra careful while using JavaScript. So right now I would just like to invite you to subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this video, because there's a lot more videos like this one coming right up. So that way, after subscribing, you'll never miss another upload. Until the next video, thank you for watching, and as usual, happy coding!